Hello and welcome to our lecture on the 1850s. This is our unit on the Civil War, and the notes you'll be taking today will be describing the turmoil, the questions that Americans were asking themselves leading up to the Civil War. The notes that you need in order to complete this lecture will be the compromise and division notes that were either you picked up from in class, or you can print them from the Google Classroom. Otherwise, you can write these notes down on a blank sheet of paper. There'll just be more information to write. Let's go ahead and begin. We'll start with a little bit of context, just to set the stage here. The main issue, clearly, what we'll be discussing today is the issue of slavery. And this is no new issue to the 1850s. We've been really debating and pushing this issue, down the road since our very founding. If we go back to the signing of the Constitution in the 1780s, we see the Three-Fifths Compromise. Not sure of what we're supposed to do with this divisive issue. We attempt to compromise between northern and southern interests. Fast forward to the Compromise of 1820, with this growing manifest destiny and new territory that America is acquiring. And the political divisions that could arise because of that. We create that 3630 line that from that point west, no state or territory north of it shall admit slavery, and no territory south of that line will have it threatened. This is all in order to create this balance of power in Congress so that neither North or South gains a competitive edge, because that's what each side is deathly afraid of. We move to the 1830s, and we have the gag rule, where slavery is such an issue, such a divisive issue, that American congressmen are deciding that we're just not going to talk about it anymore. In the 1830s, we have the gag rule that states that no more will slavery be discussed in the halls of Congress, because people just don't get anything done. And, we have other issues that are also dividing the nation. I don't want to pretend like it's just slavery. The Tariff of Abomination under President Jackson. South Carolina will nearly secede from the nation over this tariff that is affecting Americans on a North versus South divide. But even still, we have this division that is in many ways crossing geographic lines. It's dividing America across geographic lines. And even with the tariff, that is something that is increasingly a North versus South issue. So let's begin then with our notes. I mean, with the 1850s, knowing that this division has been growing and growing until we get to the 1850s, where we reach kind of a boiling point. And with that, we'll begin with the Compromise of 1850. The main issue at hand is, what do we do with these new territories after the Mexican War? Do we allow slavery to be admitted, or do we keep the Missouri Compromise and restrict slavery across that line? Knowing that much of the territory that we gained was below the 3630 line. The second question that we need to answer is, what should be done to enforce the fugitive slave law? This has been something that has been reoccurring, that the North refuses to follow these fugitive slave law. They believe it's a smack in the face. They feel it's unfair to them, to their moral standing, and they do not want to be held accountable or responsible for Southern slaves that escape. They don't want to have to send them back to their Southern masters. It's something that they don't agree with. And finally, what should we do with Washington, D.C.? Should Washington, D.C. be home to slaves? It's our nation's capital. It is in the South, and yet many Northerners are feeling that it should represent the nation as a whole, and we are divided on this issue of slavery. So how are we going to resolve this issue? Well, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo As you remember from our map activity, California will have a bit of a compromise. California will be admitted as a free state, despite that being below the 3630 line, and New Mexico and Utah territory will be open to popular sovereignty. In other words, they have the right to vote whether to admit slavery. And with that right to vote, with that existence of popular sovereignty, comes a new political party, the Free Soil Party, whose sole interest is to influence elections on that issue of slavery. Let's see, the other resolution, we're going to have a new and stronger fugitive slave law that is passed. So Northerners are getting are compromising on this issue, making it harder for them to get around not adhering to the fugitive slave law. And lastly, the slave trade will be outlawed in Washington, D.C. Slavery will still be allowed, but the slave trade will be abolished for reasons that will make more sense in the next slide. Why that was such a big issue, the slave trade. How did Americans react? Well, Southerners, well, first, I mean, one thing you should ask is, well, who won with this compromise? Who got the better deal? And the real winner for the compromise of 1850 is the North, mainly because of that California status. And with this comes a reaction from Southerners that they are kind of stressed out about diminishing slave territory. They're losing their presence in American Congress and representation. Northerners are feeling slighted. They're disgusted about the fugitive slave law. They're still not going to adhere to this, and they're going to see it as their kind of duty to fight against that fugitive slave law. So the territory as we see it, this should look very similar to the map that you created for America after the, well, let's see, I guess we have several different dates on your map, but this should be a good reference point for your map of how America is divided by 1850. All right, Uncle Tom's Cabin. The issue that this novel brings up is, why should Northerners really care about Southern slavery? They're not affected by this on a personal level, despite the realities of the intertwining economies of both the North and South. So why should they care? Well, what was this book? Harriet Beecher Stowe's, this was a best-selling novel in 1852. So notable that the Queen of England herself will read this and be just brought to tears about the emotional and psychological damage that slavery has done. And besides creating all of these other kind of stereotypes, we have the idea of an Uncle Tom, which is a stereotype for African American men, someone who just kind of goes along with slavery, who goes along with white culture. But the main message from Uncle Tom's Cabin that struck a chord with Americans was how slavery tore families apart. And this was just central to not just Northerners, but also Southerners, for how important the family was. And ultimately that the evils of slavery were greater than any good deeds of one single man. So oftentimes we'll see the argument in the South that, hey, you know what, there are some bad apples, but for the most part, slave masters are treating their slaves well. What Uncle Tom's Cabin says is, it doesn't matter how many good apples you have, the institution of slavery itself is inherently evil. So how are Americans reacting? Well, Northern Christians had a strong connection. This resonated with them. I want you to remember back to our last unit at the Reform movements. So much of the cult of domesticity, so much of education, so much of the women's the temperance movement, all of that was geared to protecting the family. And Uncle Tom's Cabin makes in very clear language that slavery is threatening the family. And this is an issue that really resonates with Northerners, and they get behind. Southerners are outraged. They see this as a shot across the bow, and they must then defend the morality of slavery. That slavery is actually a positive good. That slavery helps individuals, that they bring Christianity to slaves, very similar to the argument that we read from Fitzhugh, that slavery is not just something that we should put up with, but actually it is beneficial. It's good for the nation. So culturally, we see a divide on the effects of slavery, how individuals are viewing the institution. Now, mind you, we're not going as far as to say that Northerners were believed in equality. This is a heavily racist time, according to America, in comparison to today's standards. Very few people, North or South, felt that African Americans deserved any sort of equality in the ways that we see it today. However, that being said, the institution of slavery itself was beginning to was definitely being damned, so to speak. Which leads us to 1856. We move to the halls of Congress, the Brooks caning of Sumner. So the issue: could violence be avoided even from esteemed congressmen? Would even the sacred halls of Congress, could even our congressmen be, well, separated from this division that was plaguing the nation? So what happened? Ultimately, Charles Sumner from the North is issued this really, in all sense, very distasteful and insulting speech about Southerners, insulting their heritage, insulting their masculinity, insulting their culture, and essentially saying that they were a backwards nation or a region that was reliant on this institution of slavery. On hearing this, Brooks from the South beat Sumner with his cane until it broke on the House floor. That's the famous quote for Brooks' beating of Sumner. Now, this was ultimately an extreme example of the divisions that the nation was seeing. And ultimately, the effects of this saw that division as well. This is going to be used as a political issue on both sides. Northerners who are sympathizing with Sumner, this is going to confirm the savage brutality of the South, that they're willing to beat their slaves and they're willing to beat their fellow congressmen. Southerners are going to perceive the language that Sumner used as, this is typical of a Northern elite. This is typical of somebody looking down upon our way of life. They have no respect for us. They don't know us. And they will be really rallying behind Brooks. In fact, so many will be garnishing canes on their own at rallies. They'll send Brooks a gilded cane in honor of his work because they were so proud of him. So this is going to be being used as a political issue on both sides. Ultimately, the reality of this is Sumner will be severely hurt. He will be removed from the House of Congress. He has brain damage. He'll spend the rest of his days in Europe seeking treatment. So this was no light-hearted beating. This had really severe consequences for the actual people. Let's move to the Kansas-Nebraska territory. If you'll take a look at the map provided here, we see the Kansas territory and Nebraska territory being above the Missouri Compromise line, the 36-30 line. So the issue is, whether slavery should be prohibited in this territory. We already know what the Missouri Compromise says. We say that it should be. However, we've already had the existence of this new idea of popular sovereignty being brought up with the Compromise of 1850. Should we allow popular sovereignty in this new territory? California was not subject to the Missouri Compromise. How should we continue with this compromise? The resolution, a short answer is yes. We will have popular sovereignty. This is a complicated issue. It has to do with railroads. It has to do with politics, with deals, and ultimately, popular sovereignty will be the way of the land, and working towards repealing the Missouri Compromise in order to gain that popular sovereignty. Now, the reaction to this is quite astounding. So what we have with popular sovereignty is essentially the people of that territory are able to vote on whether there should be slavery or free status. Now, with a territory, you have a certain amount of people who live there, but it's relatively sparsely populated. So what you have during this Kansas-Nebraska territorial dispute with popular sovereignty, you have people from both the North and the South rushing to these territories, setting up a basic claim to earn voter status and voting. Abolitionists from the North, they were called the border ruffians, are going to run to Kansas to influence votes. Pro-slavery individuals from the South are going to do the same. Ultimately, the results of this election will be in favor of slavery. This will be done in some controversial ways, ones where some individuals were not included on the ballot. They were, quote-unquote, faked out. These voters was ultimately going to be rejected by Congress. The results is undemocratic. People weren't given their fair voice. And the result from all this is what we call Bleeding Kansas. This essentially first battles of the Civil War in the Kansas territory, where free soilers and pro-slavery individuals are literally killing themselves, burning cities to the ground over this issue of slavery and over this contentious election. One individual, John Brown, who's pictured on the bottom right, is going to lead his sons to kill 5 pro-slavery individuals. He is an extreme abolitionist. Pro-slavery Missourians are going to retaliate, and essentially 56 people in total will be killed, with cities in Kansas being burned to the ground. John Brown himself is going to turn into this legend on both the North and the South. The details of his murder with his sons are quite gruesome. He murdered those 5 individuals in their sleep using broadswords. It's quite a horrific scene. And we'll come back to John Brown later in the decade, because he will show himself again. So he will escape Kansas, only to appear again on the East Coast. 1857, we have the Dred Scott decision, Scott v. Sandford. Now the issue here, one of the most influential Supreme Court cases of the 1850s and arguably of the 19th century, could slaves sue for their freedom in a free state? Very interesting question. The setup was that Scott was brought, who was originally a slave in the southern states, was brought to the North, where he lived for a period of time, at which time he sued, saying that he was in the North, that he should be allowed to have his freedom, because there was no slavery in the state that he was in, and this made its way all the way to the Supreme Court. Now, the resolution was interesting. The conclusion made by the Supreme Court, who at this time was a mainly Southern appointees, so most of the Supreme Court justices were from the South, interpreted this decision in a unique an interesting way, ultimately deciding that Scott had no legal standing at all. He had no right to sue, period, because he was property. And regardless of what state he was in, Scott was essentially not a citizen, not a person, but a piece of property. And this brings up a very troubling conclusion of American citizens' right to property. Could the states restrict property regardless of geography? What does that say about the Missouri Compromise? Is that constitutional? If it's saying that Northerners are not allowed the rights to quote-unquote property, that seems to be infringing on their constitutional rights. This was a huge blow to Northern abolitionists because it really, at the highest level, the Supreme Court, really jeopardized every compromise that they had developed up until this point, simply by stating that African American slaves were in fact property and therefore had no rights. Now, the realities of this Supreme Court case are obviously disturbing, concluding that a human being could be property on such a official and high level as the Supreme Court. But by 1857, this was the next logical conclusion for where America was headed as a whole. We needed the Supreme Court to weigh in on this issue, and with this, it was heavily in favor of the South. All right, by 1859, John Brown is back again, this time in Harper's Ferry. The issue was the Republican Party and the North bent on civil war. Was it the North that is causing the Civil War? Are they the ones, according to Southerners, who are just itching to start a battle? So how was this resolved? John Brown, the same John Brown from the Bleeding Kansas murders, and his followers are going to raid a federal arsenal in Virginia to arm and incite a slave rebellion. This was not a successful raid by any means. They were incredibly unprepared. They were incredibly ill-equipped. And ultimately, Brown and his followers will be captured and killed. Brown will be tried and convicted of murder, treason, and inciting a slave rebellion. The reaction for this, abolitionists are going to reveal that they funded Brown for this. There's going to be a conspiracy theory that spirals from this, that the Republican Party is actually bent on destroying the nation and encouraging this attack. And Southerners' worst fears are in some way confirmed, that there are Northerners who are who seek to kill Southerners in their sleep, and to end slavery in the most violent way possible. Which brings us finally to the election of 1860. Can the Union be preserved if a sectional anti-slavery party, the Republican Party, emerges victorious? Can the nation survive under a Republican president? The resolution. Lincoln will project a moderate slavery stance. We're going to look more deeply into Lincoln's views on slavery because they are very complicated in the days to come. He believed that abolishing slavery was unconstitutional. He believed that he wanted to stop the expansion. However, his party will be seen as abolitionist because of that desire to stop the spread of slavery. The reaction? Increased Southern sense of alienation. This is the final straw for many Southerners, realizing that their country had just voted in what they perceived as an abolitionist president. They felt their institution, their way of life, was threatened by the Republican Party, and ultimately, within 2 months, 7 states will secede from the Union, and this will bring about the secession and ultimate reaction by President Lincoln to keep those states within the Union, thus starting the Civil War. Now, with that, we will come back to this question with Lincoln, get more, look more into his psyche about his beliefs on slavery, and yeah, we will do that in the days to come. Thank you very much, and we will see you in class.